Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf tzadivav. Today's daf is sponsored by Rachel Chefetz in loving memory of her mother, Hannah Cohen, on her 5th yurtzeit. It's hard to believe it's been 5 years since you left us. You're remembered not only by family, for your warmth, smile, and grace. May your goodness and strong belief in HaKadosh Baruch Hu be our strength and miss you every day. Okay, with that, we will get started with our Mishna. Starting from the Mishna, we already finished to the Mishna, so we're starting a little bit down in the daf today. What we saw at yesterday's daf at the end was the Mishna of the shtei halechem and the lechem hapanim, and what stage, we saw there was a machloka between 3, at what stage they become sanctified. Today we're going to move to the Kohen Gadol and the regular Menachot, and we're going to compare them. And we're going to see that there's no machloket in all these cases, everyone agrees. So Kohen Gadol, lishatan va'avichatan va'afiyatan bifnim. Everything in the Kohen Gadol, remember there was the griddle cake offering, the Kohen Gadol offers twice a day. All the steps of the process, although we'll see in a minute, not all, but the steps of the process we discussed yesterday, kneading, setting up the loaves, and baking them, all happens inside and override Shabbat. Why do they override Shabbat? Because if they happen inside, then they already become sanctified, and then once they're sanctified, if they're not on the table right away, and we wait till tomorrow, they'll be disqualified overnight. That's what we call psul linah, because they, so to speak, slept overnight. Without being put where they were supposed to. Now, Rashi explains what's the reason. Why does everybody agree here? And he says, this is according to everybody, l'divrei hakol. And he says, because otoch, now, this goes back and does a review of a different sugya we saw, otoch chatzi isaron shaya cholek bo eschono shel Kohen Gadol nimshach. We had a whole debate yesterday, are the measuring utensils used for dry ingredients, do they sanctify or not? So how could you say everybody agrees? This is dry. Right? We're talking about the solet of the Kohen Gadol, and it goes in a dry measuring utensil. So Rashi explains that, if you remember, there was the isaron and the chatzi isaron. What was the chatzi isaron for? The only thing the chatzi isaron was used for was for the Kohen Gadol, because he took the isaron that he took in the morning, and he divided it in half into the chatzi isaron, into half of the morning, half of the evening. So that one was sanctified. So now what Rashi is claiming is that even though we have a machloket about the dry measuring utensils, that's really only the isaron, not the chatzi isaron. Okay, why would you distinguish? There's a few questions here. Number one, why would you distinguish? So Rashi explains the reason why the lo mashchu isaron shalem, the reason why they didn't take the isaron, which remember is used to measure almost every korban mincha, mipnei shekol adam modeh bo minchato, because everybody uses that. And now we're going to see the distinction between a kli that everyone uses and the kli that the Kohen Gadol uses. And we're going to understand why people think that the klei yavesh were not, the midat yavesh were not sanctified. And what are we worried about? Everybody measures their mincha. And we don't trust everybody. And they might accidentally take it outside and ruin their mincha. But this one is used specifically just for the Kohen Gadol. Only Kohanim deal with it, nobody else. So because of that, we're not worried. Goes back to this reason that we talked about yesterday about the Kohanim being zrizim. It's different, but the idea is that the Kohanim will be careful about it, and that's why the chatzi isaron, which was only used for that one korban, which only Kohanim dealt with, was able to be sanctified, and the other ones weren't. That's what Rashi says. The big problem with Rashi is, if you remember, so there's the midat lach and the midat yavesh. Now the midat lach, everybody agrees were sanctified, the liquid ones. Now the Kohen Gadol and the Menachot have. Well, we didn't get to the other Menachot yet, but the Kohen Gadol has oil in it. So if it has oil, why does Rashi go so far to say it's only it's because of the chatzi isaron? You could just say it's because there's oil in it. So the claim is that Rashi held that the oil in the Kohen Gadol only gets put in at a later stage, and after it's already needed, and therefore he has to go with the explaining this kind of explanation that we didn't see before at all. We talked about the dry ingredients. It says it must be that the chatzi isaron was sanctified. Okay, that's just a way to understand this Rashi. Otherwise, it doesn't really make so much sense. Okay, moving back to the Mishnah. Tchinatan v'harkadatan enan dochot et Shabbat. What doesn't override Shabbat though? Taking the grains, the wheat, and turning it into solet. Okay, that's not going to override Shabbat. Basically, grinding them and sifting through them. That's not going to do it, because it's not going to override Shabbat, because at that stage, obviously, it's not sanctified. It only becomes sanctified when you measure it in the utensil. but not before it becomes solid. Obviously, it's not sanctified, which means it's not going to override Shabbat. Why is it not going to override Shabbat? Well, first of all, you won't have a problem of psul linah, and klal amar Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva has a principle. Kol malacha she'efshar lasota me'erev Shabbat eina docheh Shabbat. Right? Since you can do it before Shabbat, anything you can do before Shabbat doesn't override Shabbat. And since there's not going to be any problem with the sanctification of it, once it's sanctified, it's going to be psul linah, disqualified overnight. That won't happen because at the early stage it's not even sanctified yet, and therefore it doesn't override Shabbat. Right? But if you can't do it on Erev Shabbat, and that's like the lisha and the arichan and the afiyah, because as soon as you do that, if you don't put it on the Shulchan, which you're not going to do till Shabbat, because that's when you do it, it's going to be disqualified overnight, and therefore that is dochat Shabbat. Okay, so they bring Rabbi Akiva's principle to explain the two parts about the chavitin Kohen Gadol, which parts override Shabbat, which parts do not override Shabbat. And now we get to all the Menachot, kol Menachot, which means the basic minchat that a person says, I'm going to bring a minchat to the temple. It's an isaron per log of oil, if you remember. Yesh behem ma'aseh kli b'fnim ve'en behem ma'aseh kli b'chutz. Everything happens inside, nothing happens outside. Again, we mean once you put everything in, right? The lisha, the aricha, the afiyah, it all happens inside because all the actions need to be done inside. Okay. Now we're going to move to the second part of the Mishna. It's a very, very long Mishna. It goes almost to the bottom of Amud Aleph, sorry. Now we're going to talk about the length of the table and the length of the breads and all sorts of things there. So first we're going to talk about the shtei lechem. And to do this, I'm going to bring up again the pictures that we saw yesterday. Why is this picture not open on my screen? It should have been. 1 second. Okay, I'm going to share this photo from yesterday. Sorry, let's try that again. No, it's not working for me. Okay. You'll look back at the photos that we looked at before, but the shtei lechem, okay, I put up the photos maybe on Daf Savi Daled probably. So it's in the photos there. You can look at a photo of the shtei lechem, which is a rectangle. Okay, and we're going to see now, orka shiv'at tfachim. It was 7 handbreadths long. V'rochba arba'at tfachim, and the width was 4 tfachim wide. So that's a rectangle basically. V'karnoteha arba etzbot, and it had kranot. We're going to learn. The lechem hapanim had kranot. The lechem, the shtei lechem had kranot. And what are the kranot that we know of? They're the horns of the altar, okay, or the corners alternatively, which basically they're in the corners and they're like horns. They stick up on the sides of the altar. Likewise, the breads, shtei lechem, also have that. That's what we saw in the picture. It has 4, it's as if you put like 4 balls of dough. That's actually how you make it. You put 4 balls of dough, because we did it ourselves. 4 little round balls of dough in each of the corners of the rectangle of the shtei lechem, and they had a certain measurement as well. Okay, everything is a certain measurement. The kranot were 4 fingers. Okay, that's right, 4 fingers breadth rather than hand breadths, right? So it's much smaller, obviously. Lechem hapanim or kosarat tfachim. The length was 10 tfachim. Ruchbo 5 tfachim. The width was 5 tfachim, and karnotav 7 etzbaot. And it also had kranot, which we're going to talk about, and they were 7 fingers long. Okay, now, right, 4 tfachim, 4 etzbaot is really a tefach. Okay, I think that's the exact measurement if I'm not wrong. Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the 4 etzbaot is a tefach. I'm just wondering why I guess they said 4 etzbaot because they wanted to compare to the 7 etzbaot, because why wouldn't you just say a tefach if it's 4 etzbaot? But I think it is the 4, because think about your tefach. When you make a tefach, right, it's 4 etzbaot. It's 4 fingers. Lechem hapanim. Okay, so we said the lechem hapanim is 10 by 5 by 7. Again, 10 by 5 is the same measurement, hand breadths, and 7 is fingers, which is 1 3/4 of a tefach. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, shelo tit'eh, so that you don't make a mistake, zidad yahaz. This is, in other words, I'll give you another phrase that Rabbi Yehuda is known to say, which you know from the Haggadah. Rabbi Yehuda haya noten behem simanim, ditzach, adash, ba'achab. He liked to make these simanim that people would remember things. So zidad yahaz, zayin dalid dalid, that's 7 by 4 by 4. Again, 4 and 4 are not the same 4, right? 7 by 4 width and length of the shtei lechem, with 4 etzbaot for the corners. Benzom Rabbi and Yahaz 10 by 5 by 7 etzbaot. Benzom, we're going to get all back to this. What does this mean? Okay, we're the shtei halechem, fine, we have the measurements. That's pretty simple. The lechem hapanim is going to be a lot more complex because it's not exactly 10 length, 5 width like it says. So we're going to have to understand what that means. Okay, I'll already tell you the problem. If you say it's 10 in length and 5 in width, well, the table, the Shulchan, okay, we're going to see, at least according to one opinion, was 10 in length and 5 by width. So you can't possibly have the breads. We know that there were 6 and 6 on the table. It took up half the table, not the whole table. So we're going to have to figure out exactly how this sits on, and for that, I made some diagrams. Ben Zoma Omer, v'natata ala shulchan lechem panim lefanai tabit. So now Ben Zoma is already going to get us toward the direction of where we have to go, which is, he says, it calls them lechem panim. Lechem panim, what does it mean, lechem panim? You ever wonder what that means? So he explains, shiyu lo panim, that it has a face. What does that mean? It means it has sides that can face each other. Okay, that the lechem panim is not 10 by 5, length, width, and that's it, a flat bread, like the shtei halechem is a flat bread. Okay, it's 7 by 4. This is 10 by 5, but it has a face, meaning the sides fold upward. Okay, again, it depends whether we're going to go today with describing it as a teva prutza, but you can do the same thing if you're going to say it's a svina rokedet. Either way, it has sides to it. Okay, and the question is, what's the length of the sides, and how high up does it go, and what's basically going to be the base of it, and what are the sides of it? Okay, what's the height of all that? We're going to get into all that. By the way, some people also say when he says panim, he also means panim like pinim. Pina in Hebrew is a corner, and that it also references that it has kranot, it has corners to it. Okay, which we're going to talk about as well, what those look like. Hashulchan or ko asara v'rochbo chamisha. So now I'm gonna basically show you. Thank you, Julie. I forgot to mention that. Very important. I wasn't just comparing it, saying the mizbeach has kranot, but in this way, both the lechem hapanim and the shtei halechem resemble, to a certain extent, the mizbeach. Okay, they're rectangular, not square, but still this idea that you have some sort of four-sided shape, which has these kranot in the corners of it. So lechem. So now I just want to share my screen for a minute. Okay, let's pull this up. Okay, take a minute for it to come up. Okay, here's a picture. Now, if you're listening, you can open it on either in the podcast details, which again I still think Spotify doesn't show the details. But if you're listening on any other podcast app, you can find the link in the details there, and also on the site. You can find it on today's stuff, the picture, the image here. So we're going to basically see that there's a machloket about the way the lechem hapanim worked, and it depends on how, in other words, how it folded, how long each side was, and it depends on this machloket, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir, about how long the Shulchan was. I'll start with some background, and we're going to get much more into this tomorrow, which is in the temple. There were different measurements of an amma, how much a cubit is. Some people thought there were 5 handbreadths in an amma, and some people thought there were 6. So in the Torah, it says that the Shulchan is 2 amot by 1 amma, 2 amot in length, 1 amma in width. So if you say that each amma is 5 tfachim, then you're going to get to 10 by 5. If you're going to say that it was 6 tfachim in a cubit, then you're going to get to 12 by 6. Okay, very simply, 2 by 1. What is 2? What is 1? Okay, is it 6 tfachim in each one? Is it 5? Okay, so now, we're going to have to figure out how to, I just want to get this as big as I can. Let's try to center it. Okay. So now they're going to say, and the question is, how did it sit on the table? So, Shulchan or ko asara v'rochbo chamisha. We're in the first opinion, which is Rabbi Yehuda. And he says that the length and width, what is that doing? That's not what I wanted to do. Oh, wow, I just ruined my picture. 1 second. Okay, let's try to do this again. Well, that's why I want to be in present mode. There we go. Now I figured out. Now I just have to center it. Sorry. Not as familiar with the whiteboard feature here. Apologize for my delay. Okay, here we go. Shulchan or ko asara v'rochbo chamisha. So it's 10 by 5. Okay, that's the black here. 10 by 5 is the table. Lechem hapanim. Now I said, here's the problem. or ko'asara v'rochba'asara, it was also 10 by 5. Now, if all the lechems were 10 by 5, then we'd have to pile them one on top of the other, 12 high, and we know that's not the case. We saw the pictures of the Shulchan the other day. There's one marechet, there's two marechets, right? There's shtei marechot, it talks about in the Torah. There's 2 sections, and each one has 6 of the loaves. So what do? Noten orko keneged rochbo shel shulchan. So we basically put the bread, okay, just think about this if you don't have a picture, lengthwise across the width of the table. So the width of the table is 5, and we're going to put our 10 in length, okay, which obviously is going to jut out, right? 2.5 on one side, 2.5 on the other side, okay, because we're going to put it, let's say, center it, 5, right? And then 2.5 juts out one way, 2.5 juts out that way, but it doesn't really jut out that way or jut out that way because we're just going to fold that part up. We're going to say, yeah, it was 10 in length, but it folds up the sides, okay? The sides are higher. Again, if it's a teva prutza, so that's exactly the way we saw. The sides go up. If it's a sfina rokedet, still we said, right, it's a boat, it's rounded at the bottom, and the sides go up. So basically, we're going to say the following. Noten or kokeneged rochbo shel shulchan, so the length of the bread, which is 10, goes across the width of the table. V'kofel tfachayim v'mechza mikan v'tfachayim v'mechza mikan. And then it has 2.5 tfachim on this side, 2.5 handbreadths on the other side, and that's how it goes upward. Now, it doesn't tell you this, but it was 5 in length, and what did we say, right? Actually, we did say this before. It was 10 by 5. So it's 5 in width. Now, the width goes according to the length of the table. Now, that's perfect, because this is going to basically take up the entire half length of the table, because if the width of the bread is 5 and the width is going lengthwise, okay, that's this arrow here, then it's going to basically cover the entire table, half of that table. And then we're going to have the same thing on the other side. So according to this image, I just want you to understand, we're basically talking, I drew it over here, but it really goes to the end here and the end there because it's 5 all the way across. It's 5 all the way by the width, okay? It's 5 by 5 it takes up, and 2.5 of height. Okay, so now if you do that on both sides of the table, you're going to fill the entire surface of the table with bread. Okay, we'll get back to that. That's what he says right in this next line. Sorry, here it is. Nimtza or kol memalei rochbo shel shulchan divrei Rabbi Yehuda. And then the length of it is going to basically fill the width of the table. Okay, that's exactly what I said because it's 5. Okay, so the 10 by 5 ends up really being 5 by 5 with a height of 2.5 going up. Rabbi Meir Omer. Okay, now we have to move to Rabbi Meir's picture. So Rabbi Meir says, here we're lower down. Rabbi Meir had a different view of the table. Rabbi Meir's view, or the sizes of the table. Okay, in Rabbi Meir's view, the table was 12 by 6. Okay, so hashulchan or kol shnei masal v'rochbo shisha, because each ama is 6 handbreadths. So it's basically 12 by 6. Lechem hapanim, well, he agrees with the lechem hapanim, it was orko 10 v'rochbo 5. But they both basically agree that the length of the bread goes across the width of the table, which means that you're going to be able to go farther here because you have 6. So noten or kokeneged rochbo shel shulchan. Kochvel tfachayim mikan v'tfachayim mikan. So you're going to basically now have 2 tfachim going up on either side, because if you put 6 according, right, you take this thing that's 10 in length and you're going to spread it across the width of the table. You're going to fill up, it's going to sit on the table at 6. 6 of them will sit on the table. And then you're left with another 4. So 2 on this side go upward and 2 on that side go upward. Utfachayim v'revach. Now, what's the issue? Well, it's 5. So 5 is actually only going to go, again, I didn't put it this way because I didn't want you not to see it. But really the bread starts at the edge of the table on the left here. And it goes all the way across, but only 5, because everyone agrees it's 10 by 5. So while the length of the bread takes up 6 across the width of the table, but the width of the bread is 5, which goes across the length of the table, which means that you're going to have some space here. You're going to have 1 tefach of space before you hit the midpoint of the table, and the same thing on the other side. You're going to have 1 handbreadth of space before you hit the midpoint of the table. So there's empty space here, and that's what the Mishna is going to say. Okay, there's 2 tefachs of space in the middle. What's the purpose of that? So that you get some air in between the breads. Okay, just like we talked about the rods add air, also here there's some air. We don't want them touching each other. Okay, obviously in the first picture of Rabbi Yehuda, they're touching each other because 5 and 5, right? That's all there is. There's no more space. Abba Shaul Omer, he says, no. The point of this base was for something else. Shama yunotnim shnei b'zichei levona shel lechem hapanim. You put those bowls of frankincense there. That's exactly what this little space is for, the tefach. Okay, the tefach is not very big, by the way, right? But it's enough to fit the bowl of frankincense. You put them right there in the middle. Amrulo, the rabbi said to him, what do you mean? It says you put on the ma'arechet, the levona. What does it mean on? On top of. On top of what? On top of the breads. Notice you put it on the highest bread on that pile there of breads. Amar lahem harik farnei amal v'alav matem menashe. Sit back to him. He says to them, what do you mean? Alav matem menashe is not on top of. Basically, alav means next to. Remember, we have that whole machloket, is alav next to or is it on top of? So basically, alav could be next to, and that's Abba Shaul's proof that it's in the middle. So we have this machloket where the bizichei levona in between, and that obviously would only work according to Rabbi Meir's approach because there is no in between in the first approach in Rabbi Yehuda, or were they sitting on top? Okay. Now the Mishnah continues. Arba'a snifim ayusham. Okay, we can stop this for right now. Arba'a snifim shel zahav ayusham. Now we're going to go back to the picture of the Shulchan because we're going to talk about the snifim. Okay, if you remember, those are the panels on the side. Okay, there were these 4 panels on the side. Mefutzalim merashehen shayu somchim behem. Okay, we have these mefutzalim. The mefutzalim seem to be these little pieces by the panels where you would basically be able to hang a rod. Either they were indentations or they were, something where you could put a rod in and hook them on. Shnayim l'seder zeh, shnayim l'seder zeh. You had 2 sets of panels on each ma'arechet, for each of the 6 breads. That's how we get to 4, because again, they kept the bread in place, if you remember. And esnim vishmona kanim kechatzi kaneh chalul. There were these we talked about this, hollowed out rods. So it was a rod that you would basically slice lengthwise, end up with a half a rod, and you would have 28 of them. 14 on the side. Talked about this already, but we'll say it again. On the table sat the bread, so you don't need rods there. So you're going to have rods on the next 5. But how do you get to 14? Not divisible by 3, because the top one only had 2. You can see that in the picture. 1, 2. It only had 2 because it would only have 1 bread leaning on it. It didn't need more than 2 rods. Okay, they seem to be minimizing what we don't need, we don't have to have. But all the others have 3 to be able to support not only the bread, but the fact that there was bread on top of it, it made it heavier. Lo sidor kanim v'lo netilatam dochet Shabbat. Okay, setting them up and taking them out doesn't override Shabbat. Ela nichnas me'erev Shabbat. You would come in from erev Shabbat, and you would shomto. The kohanim would take them out before Shabbat starts. V'notnola or koshel shulchan, and leave it on the length of the table. It sounds like I'm not exactly sure what that is. And basically, then nichnas me'erev, and then you would basically come back Motzei Shabbat and put them in after. Because we talked about this, that the breads, it's not enough time for the breads to basically get ruined, so you don't really need to do this on Shabbat. Kol kelim shayu b'mikdash. Okay, last line of this very long Mishnah. All the kelim that were in the mikdash, or kanla, or koshel bayit. They just want to tell you what direction are you looking when we talk about the length. What do we mean by length? Length is the length of the room. Bayit meaning the room itself. When you walk into the temple from Shar Nikanor, and you go straight, that's the length of the room. We had that's basically the length. So when we talk about the length, we're talking about when it goes east-west. That's what they're basically telling you. Okay, starting with the Mishnah now. Okay, so all the menachot have to happen inside. Shalu at Rebbe zominayin. They said to Rebbe, where do we get this from? Amar lahem harei Meir brings them a pasuk from Yechezkel. Okay, also tomorrow we're going to have a lot of pasukim from Yechezkel. In Yechezkel, in the chapters of 40, I think it's 40 to 47, there's this, don't correct me if I'm wrong, but somewhere around there's a slew of chapters all about this image that Yechezkel sees of the future of the 3rd temple. And there's a lot of description, and that's why it's used a lot in trying to figure out what were the measurements in the temple. Harei Meir, vayomer Eli. This one is not for the temple, but this is not about measurements, but later we're going to get to chapters of Yechezkel. They're discussing in this area also the chapters relating to the measurements. But right now we're just having a pasuk to show that all the menachot have to be done inside. Vayomer Elai, ze hamakom asher yavashlu sham hakohanim et hachatat ve'et ha'asham, asher yofu et hamincha lebilti yotzi el hachatzer hachitzonah. So he sees this image, and the malach, the angel, says to him, this is the place where they're going to cook the chatat and the asham, and they're going to bake the mincha. Okay? Then lebilti yotzi otam el hachatzer hachitzonah, they can't go out to the outer courtyard because they're sanctified. Mincha dumia de asham b'chatat. So there's a comparison here between a juxtaposition between the mincha, the asham, and the chatat. Ma asham b'chatat tunim kli. Well, they're cooked. Cooking needs a vessel. That's how things are cooked. They're cooked in a vessel, right? Baking, theoretically, you could put it directly in the oven without a vessel. But cooking needs to be in a vessel. It's usually cooked with water or something with a liquid. Af mincha tuna kli. So therefore, also the mincha needs a vessel. That's the drasha. Okay, it's just drasha to get there, but we already explained kind of other reasons why, because it's already sanctified, because it goes in the vessels, but we're giving a pasuk for it. Now we're going to get back to more measurements. This is not as complex, so I didn't make a chart. It would have been nice if I did, but it's pretty basic, so it should be pretty easy to figure out without. HaShulchan or Kosara. So this is just the words in the Mishna about the Shulchan being 10. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Today we're going to deal with a bunch of statements of Rabbi Yochanan. If you say that the bread went up, that the height of the bread is 2.5. By the way, I'll also just show you, so if you can visualize, we saw this the other day, but I'll show you again, the pictures of the bread going up, okay? So here's the Teva Prutza picture, where you see the bread going up on the sides, okay? You see that? Now, what you see here, and this I said, when I showed you the picture the other day, we were going to discuss this, right in the middle there's this space. Right? In between, on the sides there's this empty space. Okay? Here and here. Now, what's that empty space? It's not really empty space. Okay? When we talk about, and I'll write in black here so you can see better, when we talk about the height, we're actually talking about up to that space. Okay? The height of 2.5 or 2, whichever opinion, goes up to there. What you see where there's a space in between there on the sides, this empty space, it's really because each of the sides has this corner that juts up above. That's the keren. Okay, you see that? So the keren is this little bit here, and the keren is that little bit there. So the 2.5 is actually only up to there before the keren starts, and then the part above that is the keren. That's one picture of the keren, and today we're going to see why there's two pictures of the keren, because there's two suggestions about how the chrono went. The second option of the keren is that here's your sides. Okay, again, I'll draw it. Here's the sides, right? It goes here to here to here. That's, right, the bottom is, let's say, 5, and then 2.5, if we go by Rabbi Yehuda. And then you have the keren, which if you notice, or the truth is, it could be the 2.5 even goes up to the top there. I think there's a machloket about that. But the keren turns inward, okay? You see that? So the keren is basically folds in. So you have a box, right? A flat rectangle, sides, and then it folds inward. The keren actually goes in according to that. Okay, we're going to see where that comes from. It's really going to come from the words of Rabbi Yochanan right now. So what Rabbi Yochanan is going to say is make a statement, and then we're going to have several difficulties on his statement. Rabbi Yochanan says, if you say it's 2.5, now remember what happens. It's bread upon bread upon bread upon bread. 6 breads, one on top of the other. Shulchan, right? Bread on shulchan. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, with rods in between. So if you say it's 2.5 of height of every bread, and then everyone has the bread sitting on top of it, it seems that the Shulchan has the power, so to speak, to sanctify things. Because remember, we talked about yesterday, the Shulchan sanctifies, according to Rabbi Shimon, right? But everyone thinks anyway it's sanctified, and will sanctify things on it up to a height of 15. We actually had this on Daf Pei Zayin, right? This is where it comes from. There we said, what's the meaning of it? You know, what's the nafkamina, what's the relevance? But here we're just talking about the fact. So 2.5 times 6 equals 15. And that's why he says it goes up to 15. L'divrei Omer, if you hold tfachim kopel, it only goes up 2 tfachim, right? The height is 2 tfachim, nimtza shulchan kadesh, 12 tfachim lemala. Okay, simple math. 2 times 6, 12. It's going to only do 12 in height. To which, I don't know if you already started thinking about questions, but there's a problem here. There's some things missing. Ha'ikakanim, what about the rods? The rods take space. So it's more than 15 or more than 12. So, kanim shakuim mashkalahu. You ever try to put challahs on a rack to cool off and the challahs fall in, right? The racks go into the challahs, or the challahs get welded, kind of sunk around the racks. So same thing here. They say, they make indentations in the bread. My time, so they say, how could that possibly be? The whole reason for the rods is mishum yapusha lechem, so that there's air between the bread. So there has to be space there. It can't be that the rods, right, created indentations of the bread and the bread basically fits right into them and there's no extra space. There has to be space. The whole point was so that we have air going on, right? If the breads are right smack one on top of the other, it's going to get rotten, right, moldy. Demagbalu porta. They say, no. It's just a little bit. So they say, okay, hayikau porta, but you should count that little bit times 6, right? It adds up. They say, kevan de lo havu tefach lo chashiv. Okay, it's not that important in the end. It doesn't add up to a whole tefach, so they just don't count it. Okay, second question, ha'ika bezichin. But what about the bezichei levona? They sat, according to the interpretation, that they sat on top of the bread. That would take up space. And again, they're sanctified by being on the table, and therefore it should be that, right, it should sanctify even higher. Bigave de lechem havuyatli. No, they sat inside the loaf. Remember, there's sides, so it was in, and therefore it was contained within the numbers that we counted in the measurements. They were counted within the bread. Vayika kranot. What about, here we get to the problem. If the kranot, as I showed you, went upward in that picture, then they're higher. Each bread is actually higher than 2.5 of height because you have the height of the keren. So, kranot legavi de lechem chayif lehu, and that's why they explain that the kranot went inward. So, according to this Gemara, the kranot went inward, and that's the picture that we saw before of the kranot going inside. The lechem alayu nechle, and then the bread sat on top of them. Okay, and then you would probably say then the height would have to be, not the way I started, but then as I was correcting myself, that the height went up to 2.5, and then the whole height of the keren, the 7 point, right, that we said it was 7 etzbaot, is 7 etzbaot turning inward. Okay? Tov. Ha'ika mizgarto, turning now to Amud Bet. What about the mizgeret of the table? Okay, what is the mizgeret of the table? For this we need to, again, put the picture up, but I will warn you, and I'll slowly put the picture up a little slowly so that you don't get confused. But this picture shows one depiction of it. We're going to see that there's a machloket about how the mizgeret was, and the picture only shows one option. So, what about the mizgeret? Here you see there's a flat board. That's the table. Okay, that's the top part. This is the Shulchan over here. It's a gold piece. It sits right here at the top, and the bread sits on that. And there's a mizgeret, which is this frame that goes around it, like another piece of, it's actually a piece of wood, gold-plated wood, okay? And it has this nice design on it. That's called the mizgeret. Literally, it means a frame, okay? But it's a little different than a frame, especially if it's below, right? A frame you would imagine going around the Shulchan itself, not underneath it. So there's a machloket about where the mizgeret was. Was it lamata, like in this picture, or was it lamala? Was it above? Meaning, and around the Shulchan. So Kimanda Amar, So basically what they're going to say is now, originally they're asking if there's a mizgeret, they assume the mizgeret takes some space on top of the Shulchan, and that it kind of, it's not just a frame around, but that it actually is, let's say, a tefach. It was a tefach. So if it's a tefach, okay, I'll try to draw this here in a different color. It goes into the table. If you would draw it above, it would jut into the table by a tefach, and then the breads can only sit on that and not on the Shulchan itself, and that would add another tefach. So they say, right, the Rashi tells you, the gova, the height of it is a tefach. So kimanda amar mizgar tolamata. So you simply say, no, the mizgeret was underneath, and that's why it doesn't get in the way of the bread sitting directly on the table, and the height being 15 or 12, basically according to our count. But lemanda amar mizgar tolamala haita. What if you say it was above? Well, they say, yes, it was a tefach high, but pirkude have a miparkada. Now, you might remember, you might not, but when the laws of Heseva, of leaning on Pesach, they say, how do you lean? Pirkadan, okay? Which is a way of leaning. So it's a little hard to understand exactly what they mean here, but basically what they're saying is the edges of the mizgeret went outward. They bent outward. And lechem begavi de shulchan avayativ. Even if you say the mizgeret was above, it was kind of on the outer edge, and it bent over outward, something like that, and still you were able to put the breads directly on the table, so that's not a difficulty. Kedetanya, as it says in a Braita, Now they want to show you that some people say the Mizgeret was lamata. That's what they're trying to show you here. Rabbi Yossi Omer lo hayasham snifim ela mizgarto shel shulchan ma'amedet et halechem. Rabbi Yossi has a different opinion than we saw before, that it doesn't have panels. These panels we talked about, okay, these things on the sides. The Shulchan didn't have panels because the Mizgeret held it in place. Now, obviously, according to Rabbi Yossi, the Mizgeret was above, right? Because then it was able to hold the bread in place. How it held the upper breads doesn't really explain, but it did hold the lower bread. Amru lo, they said to him, Mizgarto lamata ita. Okay, they said no. The Mizgeret was lamata, and that's why you see this opinion that the Mizgeret was actually below. Okay, so that was all about the slew of questions that they asked. We have Rabbi Yochanan, who basically said that if you say it's tfachayim v'mechta, you get to 15. If you say it was this tfachayim on the sides, 2 tefachs, you get to 12. And basically, he said, it shows the Shulchan is bekadosh at that height. We had a series of questions. Isn't there more height? No. In the end, we say there isn't. Or even if there's a little bit of the rods, we just don't count them. Now, we're going to say something else. If we're getting off on a tangent about this Mizgeret lamala or lamata. So Amal Rabbi Yochanan, for this we're going to start a whole sugya which continues into tomorrow's daf. L'divrei ha'omel, and it's all about susceptibility to impurity. L'divrei ha'omel, mizgarto lamata ita, tavla mitapechet me'ah. If you say the Mizgeret was below, then what's the Shulchan? The Shulchan is basically a board, okay? A wooden board that can be flipped. Tavla mitapechet. It's like a board that can be flipped. Now, a board that can be flipped, made of wood, we're now going to say, okay, there's this question about whether a board, usually things that are flat, aren't susceptible to impurity. Okay, here we're going to see, right, that if it's flat on both sides and you can use either side equally, then it's susceptible to impurity. Okay, now, what they basically say here, because this was very wide, even though usually a flat wooden board isn't susceptible to impurity, but because of its width, it was very wide, it was as if it can hold, because it can really hold things, so it was susceptible to impurity as if it was, okay, we're going to learn a bit about laws of impurity. Wood is less likely to be susceptible to impurity than metals, for example. Okay, and that's going to be tricky here. It's wood, but it's gold plated. So it's wood and gold at the same time. Okay, but he basically says we can learn from here that if you have a piece of wood that can be flipped, it's susceptible to impurity. L'divrei ha'omer mizgarto lamala hayta, but if you say the Mizgeret was above, then it can't be flipped. Because if the Mizgeret was above, then basically, why is it susceptible to impurity? Because it has sides to it, right? And it can't be flipped, because if you flip it over, then the Mizgeret is going downward. That's not the same vessel, right? It's not a flat board. Well then, tavla mitapechet tibaylach. You're not going to really know what the laws are for a tavla mitapechet. Okay? That's just, he's telling you. You can't infer anything about a tavla mitapechet if you say that. That's his statement. And we're done with his statement. However, the Gemara says there's something very clearly implied in his statement. Michlal de shulchan bar kibulei tumahu. Seems like it's very clear to him that the Shulchan is susceptible to impurity, but there's a problem. Now, number one, it doesn't have a beit kibul, a receptacle. Okay, if you say there was no Mizgeret, right, above, but below. But like I said, because it's wide enough and it can hold things, so it becomes susceptible to impurity. But there's another problem, which is it's a kli eitz hasoy lenachatu. It's a kli eitz that stays on the ground. It doesn't move. Now, the laws for wooden utensils are learned out from the fact that wood appears in the same pasuk next to the sak, which is like a sack, okay, made of goat hairs. V'chol kli eitz hasoy lenachat ein mekabel tuma. Okay, so any kli eitz that sits on the ground and doesn't move is not mekabel tuma. My time, why not? Because dumia de sak, because they learn it out from the sak. The sak be'inan, it needs to be like a sak. Now, what typifies a sak? Sak mitaltel malei rekan. A sak is what's a sack? It's carried around. It's carried empty. It could be carried full as well. Av kol mitaltel malei rekan. So therefore, wood is going to be just like that, where if you move it, if you carry it, empty or full, but this shulchan doesn't get carried. This shulchan, now it's true it got carried when they take apart the Mishkan, but they're not talking about that. They're talking about its general use. It doesn't move. If it's not moving and it's stationary, then it's not a vessel, okay? And then it can't have the laws of a vessel, of a wood vessel, right? That's not going to be called a vessel that could be makabel tumah. To which the Gemara answers, and this is going to bother the Gemara after, but the Gemara answers this, like this. Shulchan nami mitaltel malev rekam. The Shulchan is carried empty and full. How do we know this? Rish Lakish, as Rish Lakish says, and this is the sugya we learned, gets to the whole beauty of the lechem hapanim, and even quotes a pasuk from the David HaMelech story we saw yesterday. De'amar Rish Lakish, my dechtiv ala shulchan tahor. Why does it say ala shulchan tahor? Tahor michlal di katameh. Sounds like it could become impure, but how could it become impure? Ela, because it never moves. Ela melamed shemagbehen oto laolei regalim umarim bo lechem. Do you remember this? They would lift up the lechem hapanim when people would come in aliyah rega. Remember, it's in the heichal. People can't go in the heichal, but they can be in the azara and they could see it. Right? If you hold it up, people from afar or people from outside the azara could see, as long as it's, the entranceway is open there to the ulan, to the heichal. They would hold it up and show everybody the miracle, to show, wow, how amazing are the miracles of God. And they would say to them, look how much God loves you. Kedivri Rabbi Yochanan ben Levi, as Rabbi Yochanan ben Levi said, Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Levi, Nes Gadol Na'asa b'lechem hapanim. There was a huge miracle. Siluko kesidulo. The way you took it off was the way it was when you took it off is the way it was when you put it on. Shne'amar lasum lechem chom b'yom hilakcho. That's the pasuk from David HaMelech, and the whole story with the back and forth with him that we finished with yesterday about the lechem hapanim. It says there that the lechem is hot when it gets off, right? Halavai, we can make bread like that it's still hot a week later, right? As if it comes out of the oven, right? We always wish that he could last. It's always the best. Well, this bread was still warm when you took it off. Okay, so that's what they basically say. Okay, it's a clay aids that moves. And moves, well, not all the time, but it does move. They would pick it up and show everybody the bread. Now, here comes the big question, which is going to lead us to 3 possible answers in tomorrow's daf. Why don't you just say it's because of what it was covered with? It was covered with gold. Why did he have to go to this Rabbi Rish Lakish thing and this whole thing? They picked it up once every, right, on the Shalosh Regalim. Why don't you just say, Milo Tnan, doesn't it say in the Mishna? Hashulchan v'hadur b'kish hanifchetu o shechipam b'shayish v'shiyer makem makoma hanachat kosot tmein Rabbi Yehuda omer makom hanachat chatichot. Okay, let's explain what this means. If you have a table, okay, or a dulbaki, which is some other sort of table that was either lessened or, here's the important part, covered with shayish. Now, shayish is marble. It's like stone. It doesn't, not susceptible to impurity. If you completely cover, this is the opposite of our case. You completely cover it with something that is not susceptible to impurity, only if you leave a little space that's not covered to put a cup, or Rabbi Yehuda says to put a piece of something, okay, maybe a little big, or maybe a piece of bread or something. I'm not sure what he's talking about, a chaticha, but something else. What do you see? Unless you do that, it's not susceptible to impurity anymore because it all follows the cover. Shi'er in lo, shi'er lo. If you didn't leave anything over and you completely covered it, for purposes of impurity, it's not susceptible to impurity because it's covered with something that's not susceptible to impurity. Why don't we say here it's covered with metal? Gold is a metal, and metal, you don't need all these things. Even if it's stationary, it's still going to be a kli. Okay, the laws of impurity are very different from metals. Why don't we just say that? The chitamen, if you want to say maybe the covering was different. The gold plated in the temple wasn't hammered in, wasn't nailed in. And maybe in the Mishna, they're talking about nailed in. And maybe that's the difference. If it's nailed in, then we're going to go by the plating. Here it wasn't nailed in. Maybe then you don't go by the plating because it could come off. Okay, so we're going to see. It can't be because Ba'ami Nevish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan, he asked him this question. And basically Rabbi Yochanan said, no, we don't distinguish. That we'll see in tomorrow's class. Okay, so we're going to try to figure out why they treated this like. Right, they're going to try to suggest. They've suggested one answer here. We're going to suggest two answers till we get to a third, and the third one's going to work. Okay, why we view the table as gold, as wood, and not as gold. Okay, in fact, if you think about it, right, you see the table, you think it's gold, right, because it looks like it's gold, but it's really just gold plated, not, it's really wood inside. So the question is, what's the essence of the table? Is the essence of it wood, or is the essence the covering? And it's an interesting question in general about, right, don't judge a book by its cover, or, right, like what's inside. Maybe there's a lesson to be learned there. Okay, we'll quickly review. We started with the chavitin Kohen Gadol, compared that and the minchat to the previous Mishna about the shtei, halechem, and lechem hapanim. At what stage did they become sanctified? From there, the Mishna continued into the dimensions of the table and the dimensions of the lechem hapanim, and how it was folded, and how much was folded up, how tall the kranot were, which we then got into with a kranot inside, where they turned inside. That we got to later, not in the Mishna. And then we talked about also all the different parts of the Shulchan. And from there, we started in the Mishnah. How do you know all the Menachot are actually sanctified from the beginning? That we saw Pasuk in Yechezkel. And then we got to these statements of Rabbi Yochanan. The first one being, If you say it's, right, depending on the size, we're going to end up getting you to a height of 15 or 12. And then we had a series of questions on that. And then his second statement, which came off of a sidetrack of one of those questions about the Mizgeret being above or below, if you say, right, that has effects on whether you say it's havlan mitapechet is impure or not. And from there, we got off on why does he assume the Shulchan is tamei at all? And then we show Rish Lakish, and then why are Rish Lakish? Why can't you just say it's because it's gold-plated? And that's where we're in the middle of, and we'll finish that sugya tomorrow's daf. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and a Chodesh Tov.